a lot of you need to hear me out on this camera. This is the Nikon D600, and it has some unique features about it which make it really stand out, and it's made it my most used camera of all time. I'm going to explain to you why in this video. You know how popular the smaller mirrorless cameras have become now, where people are saying, oh, I really appreciate the size of the Fuji and the Sony cameras with them being that much smaller, but people have got used to and started to really appreciate the packability of smaller kit and smaller cameras and the ability to handhold them for longer periods of time. And that is one of the areas in which this camera really excels. When it first came out, people said, oh, it's just it's a consumer body, it's just too small. But I've got quite large hands, and this fits my hands very well indeed. The grip isn't quite as good as, say, the D750. However, there's not that much in it, and this is a very comfortable camera to hold for long periods of time. Having cameras that are easy to pack translates into so many things, because it means you can take a really small shoulder bag if you're traveling. Now, one of the most standout features that the D600 has is its color rendering straight from camera. But the files are so easy to manipulate and work into a color range that you like. They're just so pleasing to edit and work with. They have this look about them, and the skin tones are so nice. The colors fall into this sort of slightly filmic, just beautiful tones and tonal gradations. They are wonderful, and it has better color rendition and editability of the files than it's better than the D750, easily. Better than the D800, better than the D810, better than the Z7 and the Z7 II, better than the Z8, the Z9, and kind of the list goes on. You'd have to look at the D700 to beat this, but even in its own way, I think the D600 has something else about it that's maybe the colors aren't quite as good as the D700, but that kind of filming. The difference is that when you're editing the pictures, especially people pictures, the D600 pictures, when you're editing the raw files, just seem to slide into a very pleasing look very quickly, whereas other cameras just take quite a lot more work. And the difference is like this. When you shot the D600, and then this is what happened to me, and I tried out the D800, D810, D750 and all these other cameras, when I try to edit the files, I'm always like, that would have looked better on the D600. It would have come out differently, because I know the D600 so well, and I just know that it would be not just a level, it would be like 2 steps above in terms of just the overall rendering of the pictures. This comes back to this like classic camera thing that I'm always on about, where, you know, the 5D Mark II for me has a really special look, and the 5D Mark I and the 6D Mark I. The D600 falls into that within the Nikon range very strongly. This, to me, if I had to, let's say you're a Canon shooter or aware of Canon cameras, the D600 to me is their 6D Mark I. That's where it falls in. It's like a very competent sort of modern camera. I mean, it's not mirrorless, but you know what I mean? It's like it's got those modern features to make you think, okay, I'm dealing with like a more modern setup here. The dynamic range and just the overall ability of the files and just the kind of that pleasing tone where you just think, I know I can't quite get this look on other cameras. The D600 is Nikon's equivalent of the 6D, and they are actually obviously rivals to each other, but I mean this in terms of like this overall look that they get. They don't look like each other in any way, but they're sort of equivalents within the different systems, if that makes sense. So I would say that if I compared it even to the cameras like the 6D Mark I, the 6D Mark I is much more creamy, but the D600 is way more filmic. Like if you kind of really want to push those files into that range, it's so good at it. It's so good at it that when I've bought the more expensive Nikon cameras, I've still come back to the D600 because of it. And that is one of the key and probably the most important point. But I have a whole bunch more. Just hang on. This is a really good camera, and it's one of the cameras that I'm never going to let go. Let me keep explaining why. So the next point is actually more of a general Nikon thing. It's not exclusive to this camera, but it is one of the reasons that I like using Nikon for event photography in general. But it is something that you should bear in mind, because this being a lower end camera, it's nice that it has this. Now, on Nikon cameras, you can spot meter on the focus point. So on a lot of Canon cameras, not all of them, but a lot of them, the focus metering is just right in the center. It's like a circle. So with Nikon cameras,
you can spot meter, you move the focus point around, and where you put that focus point, when you spot meter, you can spot meter on that point. So an example of this would be, let's say you're taking a backlit portrait of someone, so the sun's somewhere off behind them, you aim the camera at them, and you want to take a picture, you can put the focus point over their face, and then you can meter their face specifically. So just by holding this button down on the front, as I hold it, it will meter on the focusing point that I've got selected. So something nice is that you can use aperture priority with auto ISO and still do this. So if you're shooting reportage, you're shooting people moving around and they move into something that's backlit, then you can literally just keep the focus point over them. Let's say you're firing a few shots as they're moving, and then they become heavily backlit. If that focus point is on them, all you have to do is literally just hold down that button with this finger and just keep shooting. And then instead of metering and taking all that bright backlight into consideration, it will then just say, okay, you just want me to meter for this little bit here where you've got the focus point. The other thing I pair this with on this camera, I just want to explain this. I know this is more of a Nikon thing, but I set this one up here, the top button, configurable on the front. I set this to the top menu item, which is auto ISO. And that lets me set my minimum shutter speed when I'm doing aperture priority. I'm going to press that front button. So watch this. I press the front button and I immediately get to here, and then I can set my minimum shutter speed. And one of the things you'll notice with Nikon is it's not full stops. You can set any shutter speed. So if I want to shoot for a bit at, let's say, a 60th of a second, I can do that. And I can take my pictures. And then I press my top button on the front again. And when I press that, I can then just come back in and change my minimum shutter speed to something higher, like this if I want to. So I know that's a Nikon thing and not a D600 thing. But the fact that it's on one of these lower models like this is really good. It's got all of that within it. Now, the next thing is that this is a 24 megapixel sensor. This camera is very much a people photography camera. To me, that's how I see it. And 24 megapixels is exactly what I want for that. Like for wedding photography, for example, I want 24 megapixels. For portrait photography, I want 24 megapixels. Like there is no benefit for having more megapixels than that. In my mind, definitely for the way I shoot, there's zero benefit of having more than that. Now, the next one is the battery life, it's insane on the D600. It is really insane because I think the files are smaller, it's using less processor power. When I shoot weddings on the D600, if I were to use one camera, I think I would, at the end of the day, still have about 30% battery life left on one battery. Let me show you the back of the camera. That's the camera that's filming now. The screen on the back of the D600 is really high quality. It's very bright. That's one thing that really stands out to me is its edge-to-edge clarity. I think one of the downsides on some of the Canon cameras is that the screens are quite heavily vignetted. Even on like the 5D Mark III and cameras like that, there's just a natural sort of vignetting to the screen. And this is not to do with the lens vignetting and the settings for that and so on. It's just the general feature of the screen. And you probably don't notice it until you use something like this, where you take a picture and you're like, oh wow, that's really clear and bright from edge to edge. There's quite a big difference. The thing with screens is we kind of rate screens based on how many pixels they have. Is this like a sort of a 1080p screen or whatever? But there's, when you go to like a sort of a budget hotel and they've got a 4K TV and then it looks like the television from the 1980s, even though technically it's 4K. So screens are not always made to the same standards and quality levels. One thing with Nikon is, and I think they've probably pretty much always done this, is they've always tried to put really high quality screens on their cameras. And that really helps you when you're trying to judge your exposures. Another thing you get is the dual memory card slots. So you get 2 SD card slots like this. And whilst that might not seem like a big deal, I would prefer to have 2 SD slots than a CF and an SD slot. SD cards are just so available still and everywhere. The other thing, which really surprised me at the time, which I really wasn't aware of and didn't think would be the case, is that the D600 is weather sealed to the same standard as the D800. And then that in some ways doesn't surprise me because, like, can you see some of the drop damage on this camera?
like this, and it's kind of all over it. So I've dropped these things from sort of hand holding height, and then they bounce off something and then hit the floor, and there's nothing wrong with it. These cameras are built to an incredibly high standard. I think if you get it, you would pick it up and you'd be like, yeah, it feels really solid, but there's something, I think because of the design of the body, it just feels like a little bit sort of prosumer, but it's not. They're very, very tough. The other thing I really like on the D600 that it has that the D800 and so on don't have. So if you look here, you'll see you've got U1 and U2. So one of them could be aperture priority, auto ISO, minimum shutter speed of a 400th of a second. The other one could be the settings that you like to use when you're using flash. For some reason, Nikon thinks that that's a more of an amateur feature, and it's not really present on a lot of their sort of higher rated cameras. It is on the D600. When you start to bring all of these things together, what you've got is you've got a lightweight camera that's cheap with 2 memory card slots, probably the best rendering out of a lot of the modern Nikon cameras. And it's just light and easy to carry. So who would I recommend this for? Think about this, right? If you were starting out doing wedding photography, you could have 2 of these for a really low price. You could put an 85mm 1.8G on one and a 35 1.8G on the other, or maybe the 28mm 1.8G, which might be my choice because in the UK, sometimes having just that little bit extra width means that you're not then swapping out your wider lens quite as often. Maybe just add in a 20mm 1.8G superb wider lens. You could probably do a good lot of work with that setup, and you wouldn't be fussing so much with the storage space. Even though I know storage space is cheap, it's still a hassle. So the counter argument is always, why don't you just get the D800 or the D810 instead? Having used the D800 and the D810 and the D750 and so on, I still always seem to end up coming back to the D600. Well, there's 2 reasons. The secondary reason is just the size of it. It's just much nicer to use for a long period of time, especially if you're doing weddings. Just that lighter weight and smaller size, whilst being big enough to really fit in your hand properly, it's really nice. But the number one thing is just the files that come out of them. I just don't think that the other cameras touch it. It's just got this look that it's just hard to keep consistently matching that on other cameras, and it's so easy to do it on the D600 that's why I end up going for it. Now, there are downsides on this camera. Let's get into that quickly. This isn't going to take long because there aren't many, but there are some. They're kind of significant and you should be aware of it, but at the same time, they don't have to really be a big deal. The first one is that you can't program this record button to do ISO. The ISO button is here at the bottom, and it basically has to be there. It's not a bad thing on the D600 because the button is at the bottom. Because of the position of it being the last one at the bottom, it's very easy to grab the camera body and just hit the bottom corner of the camera and change your ISO. It sounds like, oh, that's such a pain, it's a nuisance. You're not going to fumble around to try and find it because it's just there at the bottom corner. So whilst it might be nicer to be able to program it on here, you get used to it so quickly that it really doesn't make a difference. I think for people that use really big lenses, that could become an issue. Something everyone should know about Nikon cameras, because for some reason, I think that people aren't aware of this, and Nikon don't tell people. It's obviously in the manual, but it's one of those things that every time I mention it to people, I'm amazed at how many people still don't know it. But it's just generic across Nikon cameras, really. When you press the ISO button down here, you're changing the ISO with the back wheel, and the front wheel will toggle auto ISO on and off. So you can just keep spinning it, on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off, and the other direction will go on, off, on, off, on, off, on, off. So what I mean is, if you're in manual mode and everything's set manually, and then you quickly want auto ISO, if you press the ISO button on the back and turn the wheel in any direction, because auto ISO is off, any click that you make in any direction switches it to on, and then any turning of the dial in any other direction switches it off again. It's very quick and easy to do that. There's two more kind of downsides with the D600, and one of them would be a big deal for certain types of photographers, but not for others. And that is that the screen on the back, whilst it has live view, it doesn't have exposure preview. So this would probably, for a lot of people, rule this camera out for things like landscapes, because you can see your composition, but you can't see your exposure. It just gives you an auto sort of generated, like it's as if it's in auto mode on the back of the camera. Now, you can set what you want the exposure to be, and it will take that exposure, but the preview will be auto. If you like to set your exposure with live view, this won't do it. But if that's not something that you actually do, if you take a test shot, look, and then change it, then this is fine. And the last one, which I will touch on, is that the focus points are more centrally clustered than they are on, say, the D700 or the D800. But I would also say it's not been a problem for me for the things that I photograph. It hasn't been an issue. It gets me close enough, and I maybe focus and recompose a little bit. I tend to cut the focus points down to 11. You can change that in the menu settings on most Nikon cameras, because I don't like doing the press and trying to, make the focus point go around the screen. I tend to just use 3 focus points. I use the middle one and the outside edges. So if it's in portrait orientation, I'll use the top one, the middle one, bottom one. And when it's sideways, it's the same thing. It's the left one, the right one, and the middle one. And I kind of don't use anything else, because I just don't need anything else. So I don't see the point in kind of jumping the focus point around like that. I just use those 3. And in terms of the focus system itself, and I've said this before in other videos, so because people say, isn't the focus system, not as good as the other cameras? So I shot a wedding with one D750 and one D600, this one. And I used them side by side. If I sit down in a room and I pick up each camera, I feel like the D750 feels snappier and more confident in what it's doing. When I shot the wedding that I shot, I couldn't perceive much of a difference between the two in actual use, because I was concentrating on what I was doing. Although the D750 was probably better. And the D750 has kind of like a legendary good autofocus system in it. I can say the same sort of thing with the D810 as well. And so when I looked at the pictures afterwards, I didn't have pictures out of focus with either camera. And this was a really low light winter wedding in London, like really low light. But yeah, neither camera was missing photos. They were both achieving it. So I would say that if you test it, the D750 and D810 focusing system is probably technically a little bit faster and a little bit better. But my real world usage of it in very low lighting conditions, using the 1.8 primes, because I think lenses do matter. Using the 1.8 primes, I didn't have any more missed shots on the D600 than I did on the D750. Anyway, that's enough of that. Take care. See you later. Bye-bye.